Welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight, and today we are bringing this trilogy of C.S. Lewis episodes that I am retroactively calling C.S. Lewis Faith and Joy. Yeah, I'm officially dubbing this a series here on the show, C.S. Lewis Faith and Joy. I did not intend for this to be a series. I just chose some resources to help me prepare my sermons for this month during my preaching residency, and it turns out that C.S. Lewis's just writings and beliefs on faith, particularly his conversion to Christianity, is so intricately entwined with joy that it actually makes sense just to go ahead and say, yes, these 3 episodes should be listened to together. So yeah, congratulations, you got a series out of this, C.S. Lewis, Faith and Joy. And we're bringing this little trilogy of episodes to a close today, talking about C.S. Lewis on joy. Last week's episode was kind of the pivot from the faith to the joy, and now we're going to be speaking specifically on joy. In the first episode of this now trilogy series, I talked about C.S. Lewis on faith, specifically his conversion from deism to Christianity, trying to answer the question, what does it mean to believe? And looking at the why we should have a simple, childlike faith versus how we often try to, when you look at like Hebrews 11, 1 through 3, this idea of building, or, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, how we often have these assurances in things that lead us to either an incomplete view of God or not the right gospel or pride, or incomplete gospel is probably the more accurate way to say that. But a simple faith, as Lewis demonstrates in his own conversion, is where we should be. And then in last week's episode, as I mentioned, I reviewed the film The Most Reluctant Convert, that does a good job of visually displaying all the different ways that C.S. Lewis tried to navigate the spiritual and philosophical world for himself, the religious world for himself, all while, I guess you can very cheesy Christian say, all while the whole time searching for Jesus, but really for him, searching for joy, recapturing that moment of joy that he felt as a kid when his brother brought to him a biscuit tin that he had decorated with nature to make it look like a little fairy garden, and this experience that Lewis had internally that he calls joy. And that brings us to right here, right now, as I am finishing preparing for a sermon on joy. So why preach about joy? Well, partially because I wanted to spend some time reflecting on joy right before Lent. The church that I'm preaching at, they're not going to do Lent. That's not of their tradition, but it's right around the corner. Next Wednesday, this coming Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. So we are headed into the Lenten season. And just as a reminder, yes, Fish Fridays is back. This coming Friday, My Seminary Life will be moving to Fridays for the Lenten season. I'll talk more about that when we get to the end of the episode. But I wanted to, as we move into a season that is more introspective, that forces you to reflect on your death and the death of your Savior, just a very heavy time period, I wanted to spend some time reflecting on what does it mean to be joyful? What is joy? What is joy? What is it even? Because it seems like a lot of times, still to this day, Christians kind of have a hard time even talking about or explaining what joy even is, which is why I find C.S. Lewis's definition of joy to be so helpful in this attempt to try and understand what joy is. So both I'm trying to prepare myself before heading into Lent, and also just coming back to the table of, here, this is something that we are supposed to be, but we don't quite understand what it is even. So let's talk about it. When it comes to joy, if you've been around the block in the Christian-y world before, you have maybe heard joy described as this acronym of Jesus, others, you. If you know you are joyful when you are putting Jesus first, then others, then you. That is what joy is. And that sounds right, and it works in a children's Sunday school classroom, I guess. But when you think about it for a moment, that's not so much joy as it is just being a Christian. Being a Christian is someone who loves God, loves others, and lives in humility. Like that's just being a Christian. It's not so much like what I don't think that is actually the definition of what joy is, as that's what following Jesus looks like, is putting him first and then loving others and then living in humility. So we're just going to put that one to the side. The other one that often comes up in kind of the like Christian-y world is that joy is like contentment. And I understand in a way where someone would be coming from if they were to say that this is contentment. I think it is more than contentment, mainly because if joy was contentment and being content, then we wouldn't have two different words to describe it. We would have it would be one thing. Maybe being content is part of joy, is like a small smackroll of what's going on there, but it is not, they're not equal to each other completely. Lewis talks about, when he talks about joy, it is not happiness or pleasure. And the main reason for that is not that there's anything wrong with happiness or pleasure, which, again, depending on your Christian world, there probably is a problem with happiness and pleasure, but that's not the point he's trying to make here. His issue with trying to compare joy to happiness or pleasure is the fact that you can actually control that. You can control being happy. You can get pleasure. You can do things, seek things out that make you happy, that give you a sense of pleasure. Joy, on the other hand, is, and this is my words versus I'm trying to summarize how Lewis puts it. Joy is a taste of heaven now. Joy is a taste of what is to come now, in the moment, which is different from happiness, pleasure, and I would also say contentment. I could see how people try to put joy and contentment together because those are more experiential. They're more state of beings versus happiness or pleasure, which are more emotional. Again, there could be a sense of happiness or pleasure within joy, but they are not equal to joy. But joy is this like experience of what is to come now. And Lewis goes on to describe, and this is something I talked about a little bit in last week's episode, that I have often neglected when he talks about joy. And I think actually gets neglected a lot of times when people talk about Lewis talking about joy, is that it's also a kind of grief. And we don't normally think of grief in positive light, especially within certain circles of Christianity where we're just going to completely ignore ever feeling any kind of sense of grief or sorrow unless it's Good Friday. But it is a kind of grief because it comes and then it goes again. As soon as you realize what is going on, this experience that you are having, it's gone again. And the grief part there is that longing to have it back, even though you may never ever get it back, which again makes it different from happiness, pleasure, or even contentment. Really, there are ways to get those back, especially happiness, especially pleasure. There are ways to get those back. But joy is out of our hands, might be the simplest way to put it. Joy is out of our hands. It is something that is of God that we experience that we cannot necessarily control in order to have the experience. And this takes me to a moment where, strictly speaking, Lewis is not a mystic. I think anybody who is like of the anyone who's more in the world of being a mystic and a spiritual person versus I am, I've kind of been floating in this pool since college at least, but just floating, not necessarily head over heels yet into it. But as somebody who has been familiar with it for over 10 years now, it's hard to say that C.S. Lewis is a mystic, especially when you get into like his more apologetic writings and his more theological, heavy theology writings, because he is very logical and reason driven within his arguments. However, though to say C.S. Lewis is a mystic isn't necessarily accurate, to say that C.S. Lewis can get spiritual, has poetic, esoteric writings, that he is a romantic, as in a romanticism, romantic writers of the past, that is an accurate statement to say. So is he a full-fledged mystic? No. Does he also have moments of leaning into it? Yes, he does. I will make the argument that he does. His writing on joy is very experience driven. Not his experience, well, I guess partially his experience, but it is an experiential thing that is happening within his understanding of what joy is. Or you look at in Mere Christianity, where he talks about God being spirit, and he is in a dance with the sun, and the outcome of the dance is the spirit. Or you look at The Abolition of Man, where he talks very openly and positively about the Tao. Like he has these moments of mystic, spiritual, esoteric leanings, but not necessarily fully on brand with mysticism. And all the Christian mystics out there can come for me in the comments if I'm accurate or not. But that takes me back to now the sermon aspect of this, because you're probably thinking to yourself, that all was great. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. How in the world are you going to preach that? Because it's one thing, Brandon, for you to come on your podcast and meander around. We're used to that by now, and that's what we come to expect. That's why we listen to My Seminary Life, to listen to you ramble and occasionally break the fourth wall like you are right now. How in the world are you going to preach that? Well, to be honest, one, I do break the fourth wall when I preach sometimes, and two, it's not like the Bible doesn't talk about joy, right? It does come up. And for this sermon, welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight, and now pivoting, this is also kind of a rabbit trail style episode. Now it's My Seminary Life Inception. So I have preached on the topic of joy before, and I preached out of Psalm 30. Quick refresher, Psalm 30 is the famous, there may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. You have turned my mourning into dancing. Those are the two famous verses that come from Psalm 30. I preached this message, I think it was about 3 years ago now. I don't think producer Cooper was born yet. So 3 years, at max 4. But that seems a little far. So 3.5 would be my guess. And I was called upon to preach at a church that had preached at before, but I was called upon to preach at a church very last minute, because the pastor went from being fine to life support very quickly. And this was a very scary, very difficult situation for the congregation. That pastor had been the pastor of the congregation longer than I have been alive. And so naturally had very deep connections to the congregation. Not only that, family members, his children, went to that church. So this was a very tender, very scary situation for this congregation. And so I went into it knowing I have to say something comforting. I don't want to promise too much, but I need to say, I can't not address the elephant in the room. So now we fast forward to 3 years later, and I'm 3 to 4 years later, and I'm sitting down looking at my old notes as I prepare this sermon, and I think to myself, gosh dang it, I promised too much. I tried, folks. I really did try, and it goes to show you how much this is one of the reasons why it is actually good to save sermon notes. I used to save every little scrap of paper. Thankfully, I've switched to digital since then. But it is helpful, not just because it's like, okay, I'm in a pinch, I need a sermon, let me look at my Google file and see what I have. But it is one of those moments where, whenever I preach an old sermon, I pull out my notes, I sit down, and I work through it again. I study the passage again, try to look at it through different lenses than I did the last time. And, there have been times where I make small tweaks, maybe an illustration that I recall, oh yeah, this did not land, I'm going to cut this illustration and look for something else. And then there have been other times where I just have to delete the file and start over, essentially. And it wasn't quite that, but basically what I did that I'm like, I can't believe I did this, that's promising too much, is I presented this passage as a recipe, a formula for how to get joy. Because this is a standard formulaic psalm of David. For all the crap that modern Christian music gets for being too formulaic, look, David had his formula. God, you're great. You have always been faithful to me. Right now, life sucks, and I think it could continue to suck, but I'm going to have faith that you're going to get me through this. Like, this is David's Psalms 101. Like, I've just quoted, I just paraphrased 90% of David's Psalms right there for you all. And that's the case here. Basically, how I presented this was that this passage is a formula for joy. Sorrow plus time plus God equals joy and praise. And I don't necessarily hate it, and I don't think it is necessarily not what the passage is saying. I do think that this psalm is saying that when you are in sorrow, when you process that, when you grieve it, in time, God will be working in that, and the outcome could be, and I think that's the part that really bothered me, could be praise and joy. Because that's what the language is in this psalm, especially when you get to those parts of there may be pain in the night, but joy comes in the morning. That is not literally you can only grieve for a nighttime and now here's some joy, but it's supposed to show poetically the passage of time in processing grief. Or you have turned my mourning into dancing. Again, there's a God working in the pain, God working in you through the pain, through the grief, and in time, however long that takes for you, the outcome could be joy and praise. And it's that part where I was trying to say that this is indeed the solution, or not the solution. The answer will be joy and praise. I wish that was the case. And specifically in the psalm, that is what David is talking about. But we also have to remember that psalms are poetry. And so for me, as much as I love preaching and studying the Psalms, I'm no Hebrew expert, but I would love to teach a class on the Psalms at some point in history, at some point in the future. But the thing about the Psalms is that with it being poetry, not only do we have to make sure we're not taking every little thing about it literally, I think it also gives us pause to realize that maybe we shouldn't necessarily prescribe everything that comes from it. There is truth in the Psalms for certain, but to say this will always happen this way, I think you have to work on a psalm by psalm basis with that. And so, because life doesn't necessarily, even when you sit in the sorrow and you grieve and you process and God is working, there may be just times where the outcome isn't, I feel like praising God right now. Or maybe there will not be times where you feel joyful, And I think this is where in certain Christian corners, joy and happiness really get confused, because it seems like that there has to be that. You have to come through the storms of life so that way you can experience joy and sing praise to God. Is that joy or is that happiness that's on display on Sunday morning as we sing these songs about being victorious overcomers and all of that? Is that joy, or have we been putting happiness on display? And again, I'm not the kind of person who's like, you can never be happy, because there are those Christians who are like, Christianity is very serious. There's somehow both people who are like, Christianity is super serious, and also Christians should always be happy and never feel sad. Like somehow both of those people exist, and sometimes they look identical and sound identical. But where was I going with all this? So I'm looking at this sermon and I'm like, it is hard for me to say that 100% of the time, because that's what a recipe or a formula is. If you follow it, the outcome is supposed to be always the same. I think it is true that when we are in our sorrow and grief, that God is present and can be working in it, and that in time we could experience joy and turn it to praise. But to make that like a hard, it will always work out that way is difficult for me. Plus, if I'm going to use Lewis's understanding of joy, I cannot promise the outcome is joy, because then you have control over it. And that was the big thing, is that happiness you can control, pleasure you can control. Joy is outside of our reach. It is not something that we can muster up. It is not something that we can control. It is not something that we can conjure, but it is something that God does that gives us a taste of Him now. And so this is one of those weird moments where it's like, so what's the practical application part of this episode, Brandon? Well, it's kind of weird because I can't tell you to go be joyful. I can't tell you to go make joy happen, because it's not joy then. If we're going with Lewis's understanding of joy, that's happiness, that's pleasure. So maybe the best thing I can say here, as I lean into that corner of my life that is the existentialist, mystic, spiritual person, of how about we just slow down and enjoy life? Maybe we just need to slow down and observe what God is doing in our life, what is going on around us, and see. Obviously, if you are in grief or in sorrow right now and you're processing something, take your time. Don't rush through it. Don't feel, if you're in a place where you feel like that God is distant, the good news is, as I slap a Band-Aid on it, is that God is not distant. I know that that's how it can feel in this moment. And my heart goes out to you because I feel that way on a daily basis. But the good news is that we can rejoice in the fact that God is present in our sorrow and wants to be there with us in our sorrow, because He is greater than the pain, which is difficult. These are all very difficult things, and not necessarily how I thought I was going to end this episode. And also kind of this weird quasi, like, we're going to talk about joy before Lent, but also joy can come from pain and can also feel like grief. So maybe my plan backfired. Oh, well. But maybe the best thing, and something that I'm seeing a lot of Christians doing, which encourages me, is as I'm also on this journey as a Tolkienist of trying to strip away a lot of the distractions, a lot of the stuff, and get back to the simple basics and I'm not even talking about the simple basics of the Bible. No, I'm just talking about going out and touching some grass, y'all. Like, going out and touching the waves, splashing in the water, breathing the fresh air. Like, that's been me lately, of just like, let's get rid of some of this stuff and just experience life. And yeah, you might have moments of happiness, moments of pleasure, moments of contentment, and those can be good things that do happen and reasons to turn that back to God as we live under his grace. Praise God, we get to feel happy and pleasure and full of contentment. But also there may be those moments, if we can just get rid of all the crap for a bit, all of the distractions, there may come a moment outside of your control when something else is going to be there. And that is God being present in your life in a very surreal, very present way. And it may slip away pretty quick. But wasn't that a delicious moment? That's a weird way to put that. Wasn't that a sweet moment? I'll go with sweet. Sweet works better. Wasn't that a sweet moment to have with God? Well, that's it for today's episode. Thank you all for listening and for joining me on this surprise C.S. Lewis 3-part trilogy series. If you enjoyed this trilogy and want more C.S. Lewis in your life, make sure you're following the Anazao Ministries Podcast Network Facebook page, because I will be sharing the playlist of all the episodes that I have done over the past few years on C.S. Lewis related to his writings and other things. And throughout this year, there are plans to come back to truly random one-off filler episodes that are about C.S. Lewis. I'm really excited about the few that I know that I'm going to be doing in the future. So make sure that you check those things out if you want more C.S. Lewis in your life. If you want to keep up with the show, then the best way to do that is to follow the Anazao Ministries Podcast Network Facebook and Instagram page. If you would like to support the show, then please rate and review it wherever you get your podcasts. Pass the episode along to a friend. You can also follow the Studio 219 YouTube channel. That was the formerly known as My Seminary Life YouTube channel. It is now Studio 219, where it's just going to be the place where all my video content lives, including some of the My Seminary Life video episodes and other video projects I have going on over there. Also, check out my sister show, Kung Fu Pizza Party, which is a martial art pop culture show. Just yesterday, I did a review of Black Cobra, starring Fred the Hammer Williamson, in honor of Black History Month, where I talked a lot about how he is one of the coolest people alive, and he was kicking butt while wearing incredibly comfy looking sweaters. It's a great little 30 minutes of your life that you will want to listen to twice, because the episodes are super short. Speaking of Kung Fu Pizza Party, starting this Friday, if you listen to me talk in podcast form, you're going to be sick of my voice by the end of Friday, because starting this Friday, I will be moving My Seminary Life back to the Fridays for Fish Fridays. Fish Fridays, for those of you who missed it, was a series I did a couple years ago now. I think it was right near the end of the when I was working on my master's degree. Basically, in the original run of episodes, it came out every Friday through Lent, all the way up to Good Friday. And basically, during this first run of episodes, I talked about what is Lent, looked at Lent from different theological traditions, looked at fasting through the lens of Scripture, like what does that mean to fast, and even did a review of the Pope's, I think it was his Ash Wednesday message that year. I think it was Pope Francis's message from Ash Wednesday. Joshua Knoll was on that episode too. This year, doing something a little bit different. This year, for this run of Fish Friday episodes, it's going to be very devotional focused. Just a little devotional check-in with you all every Friday as we all move together through this season. As I talked about earlier, a season of introspection, a season of grief, a season of self-sacrifice as we fast and take on charity and other things like that. Most of the episodes are going to be inspired by my devotional reading through the book From the Grave by A.W. Tozer, who is a mystic, not like Lewis, who's like kind of a mystic. He's actually a mystic. And there is, as there was last time, of course, there's going to be a random St. Patrick related episode because I love St. Patrick so much, and I'm very excited. I wasn't planning on actually doing a St. Patrick related episode this year, but then a certain band released a song, and now I have to talk about it. So I have a little song review coming out, which means that's also going to be on Some Joyful Noise. So if you want to listen to my voice 3 times on a Friday, God bless you, you insane weirdo. But yeah, you'll be sick of me by the end of Lent. Thank you all for listening again to this episode. It's been fun doing this little batch of C.S. Lewis with you all. Looking forward to doing more C.S. Lewis later this year. But until next time, this is Brandon signing off, reminding you as always that theology is for everyone, so keep on studying.